Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History. We are continuing our series on the formation of the deep state, and we have worked our way up to chapter 24 and chapter 25. These will be the two concluding episodes or chapters in part one. Part one was all about the formation and the transition from treachery into treason, and then giving you multiple instances of that, and then leaving us at the point which the power elites, the robber barons, the captains of industry, the best and brightest, the collaborators of world, the interwar years, whatever you want to call them, they've now fully integrated into the public sector, into government, and have become the deep state. Now, this is not the end of the evolution of the deep state. It continues to evolve to this day. But this is the deep state as we came to know it, as Eisenhower classified it as the military-industrial complex. I have defined it, the end of the World War II and beginning of the Cold War and throughout the Cold War, as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. In chapters 24 and 25, what I want to do is show in World War One, they got a little taste. We got a little taste of how lucrative war was. And Wilson invited these power elites into government to help run the war effort. I gave you three examples. I'm from the private sector. Bernard Baruch was one of them. Herbert Hoover was another. George Creel was a third. That was just a small taste. And of course, World War One eventually ended. And what they realized after they ran the numbers, after World War One ended during the interwar years, was that next time we have one of these, we can't let it end. It's just too lucrative and it's too much money. So that's what we're going to see. World War II transition into the Cold War, which lasts 47 years, during which we have several proxy wars with the Soviets. We have a continuous propaganda campaign about how creating a boogeyman, Stalin for a while, Khrushchev later, the Soviets, Soviet Empire, communism, so that we stay on a war footing. And then, of course, we know what happened after the Cold War ended. We transitioned nicely into a war on terror, and that's been that's been intentional. The fact that we've always looked to create the next war before the previous war ended, or the current war ended. Anyway, I want to show through the mobilization of World War II how this time in World War II, FDR, our most progressive president, ironically, invites in many, many, many more private sector, best and brightest, power elites, deep staters, whatever you want to call them, and they become fully enmeshed within the government itself going forward. And their companies profit tremendously. And it becomes a new business model going forward. So today we're going to look at the personnel that FDR invites in. First of all, obviously, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, patriotic fever sweeps across the country. The false flag works. 16 million Americans volunteer serving. Well, not all of them volunteer, but 16 million end up serving in the military during World War II. A bunch of them are women. You can see here. And so if you remember the template that we established as a result of similar templates being followed in Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, it was always propaganda first, it was a manufacture or suppression of evidence second, and thirdly, it was a false flag. And all three of those foreign wars involved the exact same template to get the American people to swing from opposing our involvement in the war to not only supporting it, but demanding it. And it's a tried and true method. It still works to this day. The War Mobilization Board, similar to World War One, was put in charge by FDR to convert the peacetime industry, which we're coming off, we had the roaring 20s, but then in the last decade, we've had this terrible depression. And consumer production has been way down anyway, because there hasn't been much of a demand for it. Unemployment, all the problems with the Great Depression. So there's going to be a real emphasis on converting what we have of a peacetime industry into a war industry. It's going to be responsible for allocating resources, regulating the production of civilian goods, which necessarily results in rationing, negotiating contracts with labor, negotiating with labor to prevent any kind of situation that might end up in a strike. We got to keep people working, right? And then controlling inflation, controlling prices, et cetera. In other words, doing exactly what we did in World War I, which is a suspension of capitalism. Capitalism is free enterprise, where the market decides everything. And now, instead of practicing capitalism during World War II, we're doing the same thing we did in World War I. We're suspending capitalism, practicing communism. It's total absolute control from the top down. And not that the government owns all the means of production, the resources, but they control it. They might as well own it. So I've always got a kick out of talking to my students, and I ask them if at any point America, we make such a boogeyman out of communism, and of course during the Red Scare and World War I, World War II, the Cold War, that was our mortal enemy, right? We were engaged in an existential sort of a struggle for control, or a struggle for survival against Soviet expansion, and we built them up to be the enemy. Sure, I'm sure they did the same thing with us, and yeah, two times in our history, in the last century, we set aside capitalism for the purposes of a war during which we had this existential crisis. Our very existence was at stake, and we practiced communism. It's the easiest form of government. Autocracy, rule by one, dictatorship. You don't have to fight with Congress. You don't have to struggle to get legislation passed. You don't have to deal with opposition. You don't have to deal with public opinion polls and surveys. You just dictate. It's easy. It's the easiest form of leadership. It's the most efficient form of leadership. You have to deal with all it. You just kill all your opposition or put them in jail, shut them up, whatever. So during these two periods, these World War I, World War II, that's what we did. We practiced communism as far as our economy is concerned, and put all the controls in the hands of Washington bureaucrats. Who are some of these Washington bureaucrats, and where'd they come from? Well, this guy you should recognize, because he's a retread from World War I, and he is a prominent advisor to FDR. He's always on the progressive side of things. So our two most progressive presidents, Woodrow Wilson and FDR, who ironically were in charge during which we fought World War I and World War II, things that they said they were opposed to using military force. It happens on their watch. The chief advisor they both turned to is this guy, Bernard Baruch. Woodrow Wilson has actually put him in charge of the economy. He's a little older now, and FDR is going to tap into some other resources, other individuals. But his chief advisor is the same guy. So you know going into this that World War II is going to look very similar to World War I, because the guy in charge, the guy who has the president's ear, is the same guy. He's one of Wall Street. He comes right out of Wall Street. He's one of the best known financiers of Wall Street. He founded a Wall Street brokerage firm called the Lone Wolf of Wall Street. Was his nickname. That's where that movie comes from. His wealth came from investments in sugar and rubber. And during World War I, he was the chairman of the War Industries Board, and he ran the entire U.S. economy. This is the guy chirping in FDR's ear. So he's saying to FDR, this is what we did in World War I that worked so well. So clearly FDR is going to follow that same template in a increased way. It's going to be much bigger this time. The scope is going to be much larger. The National Defense Advisory Committee, nicknamed NDAC, was headed up by William Knudsen. Knudsen was tapped by FDR to come in and serve as commissioner for all the industrial production during World War II. And why not? His experience was he was the president of General Motors. We've already learned that General Motors had very close ties with Germany during the interwar period, and was intricately involved in the rise of the Third Reich, the Nazis, and of course Adolf Hitler. Well, this is the same guy who runs the same company, who's now in charge of our war effort, at least as far as the industrial production is concerned. straight out of. Now, what's significant about this? You know, you can look at this two ways. These guys were called dollar. I think they're called dollar a year men because they laid aside their private sector salary, which meant really nothing. They were very fabulously wealthy already anyway, but and they only took $1 from the government to contribute to the war effort, whatever they could contribute. This is their expertise. So you could look at them as patriots, right? And I'm not trying to besmirch them individually and say that they had any foul motives or anything of that sort. I'm just saying these are private sectors guys. They have run their corporations a certain way, and we've already learned how they run them. They run them according to ultra vires. They maximize profits. That's their job. They don't care about public interest. That's not their job. And they immunize themselves and all the people involved in their corporation to continue to maximize those profits. Now, what happens is when they get invited into the public sector, they bring with them that same mindset, that same operating principle. And ultra vires, which used to be verboten in the public sector, is now the operating principle of the public sector. And it's not about maximizing profits necessarily, it's maximizing benefit. And public interest gets shunted aside. And of course, they all immunize themselves so that they can't get in trouble or be held liable for anything afterwards. It's the same. The danger here is that the doctrine comes with them. This operating principle now transcends that just private sector, and now it becomes part of the public sector. And now instead of having public servants who are looking out for the American people, working as sort of a buffer against these private sector robber barons, or captains of industry, deep staters, or power elites, whatever you want to call them. Now they're both in bed together because they're fully integrated within each other, helping each other carry out whatever their objective might be. And the public interest is way down the priority list. This is where it happened in two world wars. First, by the invitation of Woodrow Wilson, and now secondly, by invitation of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our two most progressive presidents. And that's when the lines got blurred to such a degree that there's really just no separation anymore between private and public sector. The corporations are the government are the corporations. The same people are running the government. When they get out of government service, they go back to their boardrooms in the private sector. They just trading seats back and forth, and that they've all become part of the same racket. It happened in these two world wars. So you got William Knudsen, he's president of GM. Donald Nelson is his experiences as executive vice president of Sears Roebuck Company. You know, we all remember, if you're my age, growing up, getting the Sears Roebuck catalogs in the mail. That was the big department store, right? And he was, during World War II, he served as de facto NDAC member as coordinator of national defense, which handled purchases under FDR. And he rose to the level of executive director. Eventually, he headed up the War Production Board. So this guy was fully immersed in the war effort, engaged in several different positions and levels and things of that nature. But he was one of the top dogs, and he comes from the private sector, Sears Roebuck. How about Sidney Weinberg? Sidney Weinberg was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. They called him Mr. Wall Street. He served during World War II. Remember, these are all invitees or appointees by FDR. It's not like they came in and took these positions or demanded these positions. They were asked and they accepted. He served as assistant director of the purchases in the Office of Production and Management, OPM. And this guy, another guy out of Wall Street, William Beverly Murphy, was president and CEO of Campbell Soup Company. So he served as director of the facilities division of the War Production Board under FDR. And so here again, another Campbell Soup, another private sector, Charles Wilson, who succeeded Knudsen, the guy we talked about first, as president and CEO of General Motors. When Knudsen left GM to go serve in the World War II effort with FDR and the administration, Wilson took over for him. And then later, Wilson was tapped by Knudsen on his recommendation, at least to FDR, to serve on the War Production Board, alongside Knudsen, and so they were friends, they were buddies, they knew each other. So here again, another GM guy, Owens, Illinois. Owens, Illinois, I have a little personal connection with that. My dad used to work for OI in Toledo, Ohio, which is one of their used to be one of their hubs, a big tall skyscraper down there, the only one along the river in Toledo, Ohio, the OI building, what they call it. My dad was an architect. He worked in the OI building for a company that was owned by OI, but they were in the same building. Anyway, it was a glass company, and Faustin Johnson Salon was VP of Owens, Illinois. During the war, he was asked to serve as chairman of the War Production Board under FDR. So so we got soup guys, we got glass company guys, we got a couple GM guys, we got a couple Wall Street guys. Here's a steel guy, T.S. Fitch, president and CEO of Washington Steel Corporation. He served on, and that makes sense, right? You need a steel guy on the War Production Board because you're going to need steel for the tanks and the ships, et cetera, et cetera. What you can see what FDR is doing. He's going to these industries they're going to need, and he's tapping the guy who runs that industry to come in. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't have a problem with tapping the best and brightest to come in and help run the war effort. I have no problem with that. I think that's probably smart, right? The problem is these guys, and it's just a product of who they are, what they do for a living. They bring with them this operating principle. I'm trying to show how ultravires made it into the public sector, made it into the federal government. And then once the profits were so high, everybody realized this is a racket that we could continue going forward, and we'll all make way more money than we were before. The integration of government and private sector, public sector government and private sector corporations, integrating them, working together as partners, is far more lucrative and profitable for all of us than working separately and against each other. Let's work together. The problem is the public gets squeezed out as a result, and that's where you end up with this unaccountable, unelected elite, this shadow government that runs everything, and they don't care what the people think. They're not responsible to the people. They don't care about votes, and they have been brought in to do these jobs, and over time they build up these big bureaucracies and bring in more and more of their people, and pretty soon the whole government's full. The unaccounted, unelected part of government, the bureaucracy, is full of these people, and they all brought with them this ultra-virus mindset, and the people get left further and further behind in the distance. It creates a certain kind of government. We're going to define it before we're finished here. Let me give you a hint. It's not a democracy. Okay. So here's T.S. Fitch. He's from the Washington Steel Company. How about Irving Brown? Irving Brown is going to be important, working with labor, dealing with labor, negotiating with labor, trying to keep labor from going on strike during these price fixing and wage fixing days, right? They're not striking. They wouldn't be striking against their companies or owners anymore. They'd be striking against the American taxpayers. These American taxpayers are the ones footing the bills for all these big contracts. So Irving Brown, who's the president of the AFL, later is director of international affairs for a new union, AFL-CIO, served as labor rep on the War Production Board to try to keep peace between labor and these agency heads. And these agencies that are being run by these former private sector corporation owners are now part of the government. So it's really negotiating between labor and the government. Matthew Fox is going to be handy. He's going to be like the George Creel of World War I. He's going to be instrumental in information because he comes from the world of movies, Universal Pictures, public relations. Again, another private sector industry head. So he's going to serve on the War Production Planning Commission. And a lot of his responsibility is going to be involved in selling the war to the American people, to buy war bonds, to continue their high support levels, et cetera, get people to volunteer. Edward Riley Stentness, Jr., chairman of the board of U.S., another steel guy. He's the big one, U.S. Steel. Served as chairman of the War Resources Board. So another big steel guy. Sidney Hillman, President of Amalgamated Clothing Workers, another union guy. He was the founder of the Congress of Industrial Organization, the CIO. So this guy, Hillman, is necessary to work with the guy we talked about previous, uh, Irving Brown. Irving Brown was president of AFL. And then when those unions come together, the guy that's head of CIO, Sidney Hillman, just makes sense to bring those two into the government because they're the guys who created the largest union in the nation at that time, the AFL-CIO. He served in the National Defense Advisory Committee, the NDAC, under he rose all the way to the level of Associate Director General. So another private sector union guy, keep the peace. Ralph Budd, railroads, president of the Association of American Railroads, served in the National Defense Advisory Committee. He was the commissioner for transportation under FDR. So we've got steel guys, we've got railroad guys, we've got movie guys for public information, we got soup guys for food, transporting a lot of food across the ocean. We've got Wall Street guys, we got railroad guys, and all of these together created what historians call a production miracle. The massive spending, and again, this is public sector spending, this is tax money, ended the Great Depression. This was an important lesson to us. All the New Deal progressive legislation created a little blip in the Great Depression, but then when the spending went down again, boom, we went back into like a double dip recession. So the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. It was World War II and all this massive buildup, this mobilization, all this spending to build up this military. Unemployment goes away immediately. Think about it. You got 16 million people serving in World War II. That's a lot of your workforce going overseas, engaged in all things military. What's left is going to be hired by all these companies to build the tanks and the planes and the backpacks, the boots, all the things you're going to need for the war effort. So unemployment just disappears. The private sector industry gets retrofitted for the war effort. For example, Ford Motor Company got real good at producing B-24 bombers instead of Model Ts, right? They produced over 8,000. This is the production miracle we're talking about. This is what made the difference in World War II, is the fact all our allies, which were under constant bombardment by Germany, England, Russia, eventually, could not produce anything anymore. All their factories were destroyed. It was all coming from the United States. And we were producing more than the Axis powers were combined, three countries involved in the Axis powers. The Kaiser shipyards in New York could build a ship every 4.5 days. So it's a miracle. And here you see just a snapshot of the expenditures in billions of dollars for munitions, just munitions, talking weapon, ammunition kind of stuff, shells for the big guns, etc. The United States, you look year by year, you start off in 40 and 41, 42, it just builds and builds. Between 39 and 44, we spent $106 billion on munitions. Britain spent 41. The USSR spent 50. Look at the total allies, 204. Over half of that comes from us. And we have other allies that, but we're contributing over half. Then you look at the Axis powers combined, look at their total. Their total is less than ours contribution, just ours. And so this is that production miracle that took place. In other words, bringing all these best and brightest into the government was smart. It worked. We succeeded in creating an arsenal of democracy that the Axis powers could not compete with. The American production levels by 1944 were 2 times what all the Axis powers were combined. And this is what we could replace the losses. They couldn't. And so we overwhelmed them, is what we did with America's ability to produce things. So what these corporate owners did, what FDR knew that they could do based on what had happened in World War I, is using their operating principle. I remember before it was about maximizing profits, so you produce as many cars as you can, and at the cheapest price. Then you take that skill, you take that expertise, and now you apply it to war materials, tanks, planes, whatever, and it transfers. It works, and so and at the same time, you're creating jobs for all the unemployed people. And because you need all these soldiers, those that aren't working in the factories are going abroad, earning a paycheck in the military. And so this Great Depression is going to end along with as the war effort builds. Defense spending rose from 1.4% of GDP in 1940 to over 37% in 45. So all of the money, the public sector money, the tax money that was being used as a percentage of GDP to outfit the military and put us on this war footing and mobilize for war. I mean, the percentage of increase is astronomical from 1.4 to 37% in just 5 years. So if you're doing business, you're saying to yourself, I want to be in the mobilization business. I want to be in somehow related to the war effort because that's where the money is. That's where the increase is. The annual defense budget rose from 1.9 billion in 40 to almost 60 billion in 1945. So it pays to be a military contractor during World War II. That's where the money is. And of course, a lot of it's deficit spending. Remember now, one of the reasons why FDR wanted to end our dependence on the gold standard so that he could spend an unlimited amount of money on the New Deal. And he did. And we went into great debt as a result of the New Deal. But it didn't succeed in getting us out of the Depression. But World War II did. That was deficit spending on a whole nother level. You can see here in 1939, he became president in 32. So our deficit spending was, pretty piddly on the New Deal. 1939 it was 3% of GDP, and it rises to almost 30% of GDP in 1943. So this is where the United States of America, the modern day country as we now know it, got comfortable with deficit spending. I don't know if we got comfortable with it, but we got our first taste of it and learned that we could live with it. So you see the total expenditure, according to, you look at this graph here, you can see how much we spent during World War II. The total expenditure was estimated to be around $4.1 trillion during the war years. So for us, that was 41 to 45. And when you adjust that for 2023 dollars, according to inflation, that's about $4.1 trillion. That's a ton of money. It's the most expensive war in U.S. history. And as I said, it accomplished what the New Deal couldn't. It ended the Great Depression. So it has it has multiple benefits. First of all, we win the war and save the world from these totalitarian dictatorships, save the world from fascism, save the world from Nazis and all that. So you got that. We helped our allies, right? It also created this vast wealth for all these industries that were involved in defense spending. So you got that. Then it also ended the Great Depression. So you got that. And also created a business model going forward, which we're going to apply to the Cold War, where this could continue on, where instead of ending the war effort, ending the war footing, and going back to pre-war spending and all that, we now just continue it on, and it becomes business as usual. It becomes the new business model going forward. This is what Eisenhower warned about, this growing military-industrial complex, which is the tail wagging the dog, because that's where the money is. So every decision flowing out of Washington is now going to be with the consideration of the big elephant in the room, which is military spending, and how much we and then of course feeding into that okay, if we're going to continue this military spending, we got to convince the American people it's necessary. So we got to propagandize them. We got to create a boogeyman. We got to create a future threat. And it all works together because there's so much daggum money to be made. This is why I titled this section War is a Racket. It becomes a business model going forward. This is the way forward economically. It's very similar to what Japan, ironically, here we are fighting Japan because Japan had made a decision. Military conquest was the way to feed their people. Military conquest was the way to sustain a growing empire, an empire that wanted to be sovereign, an empire that wanted to be wealthy, an empire that wanted to be independent, an empire that wanted to be powerful in that region of the world. Uh, they tried it the peaceful way, and growth was right around 3%. When they tried it through military conquest, the military way, they grew at 7.2%. So we are learning essentially the same lesson that the Japanese learned. And of course, it's going to require an empire of our own to sustain all this, which is exactly what Japan wanted. So the irony is we are fighting to create and preserve and even expand what, for us, what Japan was trying to create and preserve and expand. The same thing. We were both fighting over empire because it's worth a lot of money. Look at some of the spending. The Pentagon was already under construction during World War II. When Pearl Harbor happened, the United States was already engaged in building what turned out to be the world's largest office. But I think it still is the world's largest office building. Used to be. When I visited it years ago, that was one of the things the tour guide told us. It's the world's largest office complex. It's just massive. It's just headquarters for all the military operations in D.C. And the initial budget for this was $35 million. And by the time it was finished, it was $75 million. They always go over, as you know. More than 6 million square feet of floor space. And you're talking about a symbol. It's one of the reasons why the terrorists attacked it on 9/11, because it was a symbol of American military power around the world. It's the symbol. And so if you want to strike the heart of America on 9/11, you strike at its financial capital in Wall Street, which is why the Twin Towers came down. You strike at the military capital, which is the hammer that is used to control that empire, maintain that empire, and even expand that empire around the world. That's the Pentagon. And then you strike at the political headquarters, which most people think that third plane was headed for the White House or the Capitol building, probably the White House. And so this has become a symbol of America's military might around the world. It's the world's largest office building, and it helps illustrate or symbolize the money that it takes to maintain a military empire such that we have. And think about it. This is why I say presidents, when they get elected, they come in and they want to downsize the military, or they want to shrink back from our presence around the world. They can't. Their hands are tied. They inherit all of these commitments. And if they were to try to take a step in the other direction, they would get impeached, or worse, like JFK, worse, or Nixon, worse. Anybody who tries to bring about peace. You look back at the candidates, the presidents who expand or continue wars, they're allowed to do that without any interruption. They might have some political blowback from folks on this side, that side of the political spectrum, but by and large, they most of them get a second term for sure. It's the guys who come in and talk peace and try to negotiate peace. Those are the ones that have problems, because peace is not profitable. War is profitable. And so if you're a candidate who comes in and say, hey, I want to make, like in JFK's case, I want to sign a nuclear disarmament deal with the Russians in my second term. And as down payment, we're going to sign this nuclear testing ban, this underground testing ban. And then in the second term, when I get safely reelected, me and Khrushchev, we're going to work towards disarmament and peace. We're going to try to end the Cold War. Well, we'll see about that. Or Nixon, who takes trips over Russia and to China, introduces a period of peace between, the cooling of the tensions between the United States and the Soviets, is opening up China to trade, is all these different things, and wants to end the Cold War. We'll see about that, and so you find out if you're a political leader what side your bread is buttered on. You better be in support of war. You better be in support of this continue this propaganda that the Russians are the boogeyman. They're evil, and we can't negotiate with them. We can't make peace with them. We can't live. We can't coexist with these people because it's either us. It's either us or them, and it's all about money. And what's profitable is not peace; it's war. So we have to stay on that war footing. And another example during World War II about how war can be a racket. Just the Manhattan Project alone, the ultimate leverage instrument. One of the reasons why we dropped that bomb, Harry Truman, and he wrote about it. It's in his book. He said, I thought this would be a real leverage advantage for us in our negotiations with the Soviets going forward because we had the bomb and they didn't. Let's show them. Let's show them what we got. And so at the conclusion of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, let's show the Soviets who they're dealing with, who's the boss. And so this Manhattan Project, which produced a total of 4 bombs, and we dropped 2 of them, $500 million apiece. So $2 billion in today's dollars, or $33 billion in today's dollars, $2 billion back then. And of course, these projects birthed entire communities, which were dependent exclusively upon this project, this top secret project, scattered around the country. I used to live in East Tennessee, real close to Oak Ridge. And Oak Ridge is a big, flourishing community, outskirts of Knoxville now, but it got its start as as one of the labs in this project right there on the river where they could get access to power, lots of power. And it's close to Alcoa, which also got on that same river and got access to power for the aluminum, build the planes. But anyway, Oak Ridge is a community that didn't exist. They called it the Secret City. It's still called that, but it's no longer a secret. You had Hanford, Washington, another part of the project. You had Los Alamos out in New Mexico. Chicago was another part of the project. But you can see all the other parts that were involved. And these are communities that sprouted as a result. They were put there because there was nobody there. And this was a super secret project. But after World War II, and the project was no longer secret, they became cities, they became communities. And it was all financed, public dollars, tax dollars, in an effort to win this war and create this new weapon. It was extremely lucrative. You can look at the comparison today. Today's military spending is estimated between 28 and 38% of GDP, compared to the wartime spending about 80% during World War II. So that's why you, at the very minimum, you stay on a war footing to keep that money flowing at a 28 to 38% clip. During times when you're actually at war, it jumps up. Now, not all wars are the same. World War II was, that was obviously a different animal, but you can see where during times of war, the percentage of military spending as part of GDP just jumps. It jumps. So this is why I say it's a new business model. Wall Street, according to Investors Business Daily, the Dow rose 133%, 130% during 42 to 46. Now, you understand this is the entity that caused the crash, caused the Great Depression to begin with. I mean, the bottom fell out in 1939, right? Or 29. It just fell out. So, and it wasn't rebounding in spite of everyone's best efforts you can see, it was just struggling along. And when it was bottomed out in 42, this is after the crash in 29, where it bottomed out first. So we tried and tried for about 13 years to get the stock market back in the black, back into a bull market. And we'd have momentary blips of success. But ultimately, by the time we got to 42, it was back where it started. But then the war comes and it just rises and rises and rises, 130% overall. So not only is the war, the mobilization effort and the war itself profitable to Joe Q taxpayer, who now is not unemployed anymore. He has a job. Either he's in the military or he's working on one of these defense plants. It's profitable to these industries that are making all this money, these government contracts. It's profitable to, it's also profitable to Wall Street. And if you were in the military, you know, because of all this deficit spending, they could afford to raise the rate for you as as a private. You made more than most civilian professionals. And so a lot of males, especially, jumped into the military because it was a better paying job than anything. You go to college, get a degree, and go become a professional in the civilian arena, and you're making less than a private does in the military. So all of a sudden, a permanent military career became an option. Whereas before, you jump into the military and the war was over, you recycle back into the civilian side of things, and now you have to start over again. Now you can make a career of it, and you start off at higher pay than their counterparts that went to college and are in the civilian world, and so you're going to get all these pay bumps and promotions, etc. You can make a career of it, retire before your civilian counterparts, and have all your health care paid for. It became an option. You can see here, good pay. You can get educated while you're in there. So you can get promotions. You're going to retire, and then when you retire, age what, 55, you can go do something in the private sector with all this experience you have in the military side of things and make more money. So all of a sudden, uh, you can see where people are looking at war differently now, and they're saying, "Well, it's not so bad." You know, it used to be it's like a volunteer army. You go fight, and or a volunteer fire department. You go fight, and then the war's over. You all come back, and whatever time you were spent fighting was just lost time. 2 years, 3 years, whatever it took to win the war. You come back. You could have been a junior in college, a senior in college by then, but now you start as a freshman. So it's lost time. Now it's not. Now it's an investment in your future career. The stock market has rebounded. The unemployment has gone away. Everybody's working. These corporations that have retrofitted to make all these military hardware, they're making money hand over fist. You'll see in the next episode, I'll show you the profits. We showed you in World War I how much profit was there to be made by these, quote, profiteers or merchants of debt. They realized, my God, there's a lot of money to be made. If you're in World War I, it was the leather industry, it was munitions, it was steel, it was oil, it was coal. World War II is going to be similar, not much difference, but you're going to see how much money is there to be made. Right? You're coming off the Great Depression when nobody made any money. Now you're making money so fast you can't count it. And of course, it's elevated the United States because we're the country making the biggest difference around the world. When World War I was over, we came out shining like a rose. The economic capital switched from London to New York City. We became the country hadn't been touched by war. We were the production. We could, we're loaning out money to rebuild all around the world. Wait till you see what happens after World War II, when all of our allies are completely destroyed. And of course, but World War II would transition right directly into the Cold War, so we can stay on a war footing, continue making all this money. It's just so patently obvious that this new business model is the way to go. If you can gin up a war, and then even when it ends, if you can gin up the next war and stay on this war footing, and you might have times where you actually have to fight. Most of the time you won't. You just be staying prepared all the time. You got this military that's you're not gonna downsize tremendously after. I mean, you're not gonna have 16 million people in the military, but you're going to have a lot because you got to stay prepared. And it's going to become an industry. And you're going to need corporations to feed that industry. You're going to need money to pay the corporations to feed the industry. So Congress is going to have to appropriate billions and billions of dollars every year. Uh, and we got a way to do it now because we're not on the gold standard. We can deficit spend. We can spend whatever we want, whatever we deem necessary. And all these corporations are going to be happy to oblige. They're going to get all these big contracts, and we're going to just build. And every year it grows. It never shrinks, never stays the same. It always grows. So the amount of dollars that Congress appropriates gets bigger or borrows. Uh, the amount of contracts that these companies get to build all this military hardware grows. The military itself grows. Everything grows. And if the tax dollars don't keep up, so be it. Well, we'll just borrow. We'll just borrow. But we got to keep this military in a constant state of preparedness. We got to stay on a war footing because everyone involved is making too much money. And these private sector guys that started off where they wanted to get access to foreign territories so they could get cheaper resources and they could create markets for their domestic products, the sugar, the coal, the steel, whatever. Now they're thinking, oh, we still got that. We're still going to make our domestic products. There's going to be a consumer demand for all that stuff after the war. So we're going to have to make refrigerators and cars and things of that nature. But now the government needs all this military hardware. So now we can expand into that direction and do two things at once simultaneously: chew gum and walk at the same time. We can make our consumer products, but we can also have these government contracts to make all these things necessary for war and double our profits, or maybe triple them or quadruple them. And we don't care if the money's borrowed money. We don't care. Remember, public interest doesn't matter. It's about maximizing profit. So if we go into debt, hey, 30 years from now, I'm gonna be dead and gone. Who cares? Let the future generations worry about that, or the future generations. What matters is during my lifetime, maximizing as much profit as possible, squeezing all the blood out of that turnip I can get. And of course, that turnip happens to be the American taxpayer. And all of a sudden, we look around as taxpayers and realize no one's representing us. They're in on the game. The folks in Washington are not standing up saying, stop, you can't overspend, you can't deficit spend, you're putting the American people in debt. It's not fair to their children or their children's children. No, nobody's there representing us. No one's saying stop. Why? Because the military contractors that depend on these big contracts give these huge, they send lobbyists out all over Washington to sprinkle fairy dust on all these politicians in the form of junkets and trips and money and all these different. And there's benefit to these politicians who are getting all these kickbacks. I would call them bribes to keep voting for these increased expenditures. And so they just rub each other's back. As long as you take care of me, I'll take care of them. They're both feathering each other's nests so that the contracts are always growing for these military hardware, for all the military hardware. And these politicians that keep voting and keep getting all these kickbacks and all these benefits. It's why these guys go to Washington and become fabulously wealthy. You said, where'd they get all that money? They never made more than $200,000 a year. They've been in Washington for 30 years, serving on the foreign, this committee and that committee, green lighting, rubber stamping, all of these expenditures for the military. And now you realize how it happens. The taxpayer gets screwed this whole thing. Congress votes these contract, the military, Department of Defense goes to Congress, says we need X, Y, and Z. Well, that's going to be $1 trillion worth. You can do all the numbers. That's $1 trillion. That's what we need to stay military prepared for whatever threat we face. $1 trillion. And so Congress, as you know, you don't want to be the first Congress or president to vote no on that. And of course, they're getting lobbied by these military contractors. And so they vote yes, and as a result, the military contractors get all this money, $1 trillion worth, and they can afford to allocate a portion of it to all their favorite politicians who keep voting yes. And so next time they said, well, we need $1.5 trillion. And that lobbyist uh, industry kicks into gear, and they start sprinkling all the fairy dust over all of Washington, all the politicians. Next thing you know, politicians vote yes again. And the contractors are getting rich, the politicians are getting rich, the industry itself, Eisenhower warned us about, is getting rich. And who's getting screwed? The taxpayer. No one's there watching out for the taxpayer. And these bureaucracies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people from the private sector get sucked into these bureaucracies, and pretty soon they're, whereas before they might have been opposed to all this military spending, all this war footing spending that just keeps gobbling up a larger percentage of GDP. Now they're part of it. They're part of the game. They're part of the racket. So they support it. And the bureaucracy, which is the unaccountable, unelected folks who run everything, part of this national defense establishment and all the industries that feed it, this deep state, it gets bigger and bigger. This blob gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the taxpayer just gets hammered, hammered, hammered. And of course, they can't keep up. You can't raise taxes and keep up with it. No politician would ever win an election raising taxes to that at that rate. So they just deficit spend, and they put it off for somebody in the future to deal with. That's the lesson that was learned in World War II. And it's now everyone in the public sector who's brought in all these private sectors and brought in ultra, they're all in on the same game. Maximize profits or benefit to us, whatever that benefit ends up being. A lot of these politicians are just unbelievably wealthy. And he's, how in the world did that happen? It's coming from these military contractors or these other industries that are involved in this racket. And whatever committee they're on, that industry is feeding them through that lobbyist system all that money. And they can't afford not to be a senator. They can't afford not to be a congressman. They have a payroll now. They got all these obligations to meet, and now they bring their kids into it, and now their kids are on the payroll, and they just got to keep the beast feeding that beast. And of course, it's not their money, right? It's not even tax dollars anymore. It's borrowed money, which is from future generations. It's a racket. We started down the road of deficit spending, the New Deal, but it was a pittance compared to what World War II created. And then we learned, wow, there's a lot of money to be made. And the American people, because they're so patriotic, as long as we make them aware of the threat, they'll continue to pony up. And when we don't have enough out of the tax revenues, we'll just borrow it. And because we've gotten accustomed to it, now you look at, we're 38. I think last time I looked, it was $38 trillion in debt. We'll never pay that off. It all started World War II, and this deep state that realized this new business model was the most profitable business model ever created. Remember, the deep state is the national security apparatus, all the industries that feed it. We'll get into the corporate earnings tomorrow in chapter 25, but you can see how that ultra virus, through all these individuals that FDR invited in, before him, Woodrow Wilson invited in during World War I, and it brought with them, it wasn't intentional. It wasn't, I don't believe it was cynical. I don't believe that there was any harm intended. We were trying to win a war. But you have to understand what comes with these people. And then once they learn that there's so much money to be made and we need to create a permanent war footing, that is when, instead of demobilizing after the war like we normally did, we created this new enemy, the Soviets, which mandated that we continue on a war footing into the future and do all this research and development on new weapon systems, et cetera, expansion. That became part and parcel with the space race, right? The weapons that could be utilized in space. It's a lot of money involved in it. And it's about weapons, and all those weapons cost a lot of money. And so You start to see this bureaucracy, just this amorphous blob, just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, washed, and the tail is wagging the dog. And the politicians who we elect, and we say, okay, you run this campaign and you say you'll do this and this and this, and then you get to Washington, you do the exact opposite. Why? Because you get informed of what responsibilities you've inherited, and you can't go back on those. No matter what you said in your campaign, doesn't matter what you said. Here's the facts of life. And so the deficit just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and this humongous debt hanging around our necks. And we now have this military, Eisenhower back in 60 warned us of a military-industrial-congressional complex. And though he warned us, and though the next president tried to do something about it, he was assassinated. And though a couple presidents later tried to do something about it, he was run out of office on the verge of being impeached. They drummed up a scandal to get rid of him. And every president since then who has tried to rein in this out of control spending, to rein in this out of control mindset that we always have to be on a war footing. We can't possibly be at peace. Any president who advocates for peace, misfortune happens to him. Something bad. And the guys who give the dog, the tail wagging dog, what he wants, which is war, constant war, money, they get a second term. All of their officials get board seats on these big companies after the wars, after their time in public service is over, and everybody's nest gets feathered as long as they continue the racket. That's the objective. I've gone on and on. I'm going to stop there. Chapter 25 is tomorrow. That is the corporate. I wanted to show the individuals who were brought into the World War II war effort, and then tomorrow we'll show the companies, the corporations, and how they did during the World War II war effort. Thanks for joining. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.